to SnapEd LGU Mentor in Your Pocket. I'm Jennifer McCaffrey from the University of Illinois, and on today's episode, we will continue our conversation about the background and introductory information of SNAP education at land-grant universities. Joining us today is our guest from the first podcast, Dr. Lauren Sweeney, who serves as the LGU SNAP Education Program Assistant. Hey, Lauren, thanks for joining us again to help provide some background on the land grants and our participation in SNAP-Ed. So can you start us off by giving us a brief history on SNAP-Ed in the land grant system?
Sure, thanks for having me again. I'm not a history buff at all, but I will tell you, going back into the archives, some information that I do have. So SNAP-Ed SNAP has been around since 1939, but SNAP-Ed did not start back then. It started much later, and it was actually originally called the Food Stamp Nutrition Education Program. So in 1988, Wisconsin Extension piloted the first food stamp nutrition education program at a local office. And so it wasn't until a few years later in 1992 that the food stamp nutrition education program became an official USDA funded program. So at this time, it became funded in 7 states, and it was implemented through cooperative extension at land-grant universities in New Hampshire, Ohio, New York, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Oklahoma, and Washington. And so throughout the 90s and early 2000s, more land grants signed on, and the food stamp nutrition education program was conducted again through cooperative extension at these land grant universities. And it was really a natural fit for universities because at the time they were also providing, and still are, providing the expanded food and nutrition education program, or FNEP, which many of you may be familiar with.
Yeah, I just find it so fascinating. And I forget that it was originally started in 1988. You know, a lot of people know when it came on in the early 90s. So it's really fascinating. So thanks for providing that background. So was SNAP-Ed always implemented as it is today?
Well, that's a great question. When SNAP-Ed, or the Food Stamp Nutrition Education Program, as it was originally known by, was first implemented, it was just strictly nutrition education. And so there was also a requirement for fund to match the funding component of it. And so many extension offices and universities at the time programmed in areas or in spaces that could provide this, such as schools or other youth sites. And so this really drove the program into a direction that we still see some of the effects of today, as many land-grant universities are, and many SNAP-Ed programs spend much of their time programming in the school setting. And so this match component was in place until 2010, which there was then the passage of the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act. And this is a time when SNAP-Ed really became known, what we know of it today. So it added the comprehensive multi-level interventions, the community and public health approaches. And this is when SNAP-Ed got rid of the state contribution, or the match, and became a 100% federally funded program. And then also added a focus on physical activity and PSCs, or the policy systems and environmental approaches that many of us are familiar with again today as a major component of the program.
Yeah, sometimes, it doesn't seem that long ago, but PSC has been around since 2010 to think about it. So here we are, and in the early 2020s, right? That's how it's described. What are your thoughts on what the future of SNAP-Ed will look like?
Well, it's been a really interesting time for SNAP-Ed lately. I think we've started to and are continuing to enter a time of big change within SNAP-Ed. So COVID-19 brought on lots of innovation in programming. States and universities and SNAP-Ed as a whole really had to pivot overnight almost, and moved to a lot of online and virtual programming. And a lot of the universities that are conducting SNAP-Ed are continuing to do some of this online and virtual programming. So we're seeing this ability now, especially with some of our virtual programming, to be able to reach and focus on some of our communities who have historically been underserved, such as those with disabilities, some of our tribal communities, individuals that have issues being able to attend our classes in person due to childcare or transportation concerns. So that virtual components is one major area where I think we will continue to see some growth over the next few years. So in addition to that, we also have the recent nutrition education branch that was launched within FNS, which is exciting for SNAP-Ed. And they're really spearheading lots of changes, including changes to SNAP-Ed planning and reporting tools with the addition of in-pairs. So we'll be seeing that launch here soon. And so it'll be very exciting to see how SNAP-Ed is able to grow and change and evolve over the coming years due to these new tools and new ways of being able to reach and serve our participants.
Yeah, I agree. It's exciting times. So, shifting gears just a little bit, you mentioned online programming and in schools. Can you talk a little bit how SNAP-Ed is implemented across the LGUs? Like, is it all the same, or just talk a little bit more about that?
So one thing I can tell you is it's definitely not all the same. And it seems to be ever evolving. So one thing I can say with certainty is that it just varies greatly across the country. So most land grants, though, implement SNAP-Ed through cooperative extension. And so land grants across the country are also implementing the three components of SNAP-Ed: direct education, PSCs, or the policy systems and environmental approaches, as well as social marketing. And they're doing it in a variety of ways. So what I would say is, if you are thinking about implementing a new program or maybe changing how the program at your university is run, there is likely somebody already doing it. And so I encourage you to reach out to your fellow land grant universities to ask questions. So that's one of the really great things about being part of the land grant system is you have 50 plus other institutions that you can lean on for help rather than starting from scratch. So if you have questions about how others are implementing their programs or some tweaks you'd like to make to your program, I definitely encourage you to reach out to us.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the network across the land grant and learned so much from my colleagues. So we know that there's many different ways to implement SNAP-Ed, but are there any unique aspects of SNAP-Ed in the LGUs, things that we do have in common?
Well, so the SNAP-Ed system, I think it's important to first, maybe we can look at the system itself. Compare, as you know, we're looking at SNAP-Ed as a whole. Land grant universities are awarded 40% of the annual SNAP-Ed $464 currently $1 million budget, at least for fiscal year 22. So we receive a good chunk of the national budget straight, through the land grant universities. And so many land grant SNAP-Ed programs are statewide, or largely, statewide, if you think about the areas that they're serving. And so that's really one of the benefits, the unique aspects of land grants is our cooperative extension offices, who are in every county and every state in the country. So that really helps us to be able to be in the communities that we're serving, and really understand the communities that we're serving. And many other implementing agencies don't have that capacity, the infrastructure that we do to be statewide through our cooperative extension offices. Additionally, many land grant programs employ individuals from the communities they're serving. Again, because we have those extension offices, we have that reach in the communities. And participants can often relate more with their instructors or individuals that are working with them from our SNAP-Ed staff when they're from the communities they're serving. They understand the needs of the communities and they can relate to their participants. And then I would say land grants also have the unique benefit of leveraging the expertise and relationships of the Grainer University or the extension system. So just some examples, we've got horticulture experts. So when you're implementing gardens or farm to school programs, you can reach out to them for assistance with growing the garden. Or we've got university researchers with expertise in different areas of program evaluation, like food resource economics or technology. So we have lots of experts that we can reach out to that are a part of our own land grant system that can help with our SNAP-Ed programs. So really, I could go on and on. The land grant system is vast, and the unique aspects of it and the ways that we can leverage some of those aspects to implement our SNAP-Ed programs is really never ending. But for the sake of time, I'll stop there.
Well, that sounds really good. Thank you for sharing the historical background and a little bit more about the land grant universities. So thank you for all your time and your expertise on this topic. And, for all of you out there, thank you for listening. And we hope that you learned something new today as well. So stay tuned for our next episode of SNAP-Ed LGU Mentor in Your Pocket, where we will discuss contracts and fiscal years. So you'll definitely want to come back for that. You can find the podcast on Spotify and on our e-extension SNAP-Ed Resource Center at snap-edresources.extension.org. And thank you all for tuning in today. The views, information, or opinions expressed during this podcast are solely those of the individuals involved, are not a legal or expert interpretation by, an endorsement of, and do not necessarily represent those of South Dakota State University, the South Dakota Board of Regents, e-extension, a SNAP-Ed state agency, the Food and Nutrition Service, National Institute of Food and Agriculture, or the United States Department of Agriculture and their employees and agents. The SNAP-Ed Land Grant University Program Development Team, SDSU, and the above named parties, employees, and agents are not responsible for and do not verify for accuracy any of the information contained in the podcast series available for listening. The primary purpose of this podcast series is to educate and inform. This podcast series does not constitute professional advice or services. The developers of SNAP-Ed LGU Mentor in Your Pocket and the above-named parties assume no liability for any activities in connection with this podcast or for use of this podcast in connection with any other website, computer, playing device, or use of any information contained in the podcast. This podcast is available for private, non-commercial use only. You may not copy, edit, modify, or redistribute. This podcast is intellectual property of South Dakota State University and cannot be used without permission. To inquire about permissions for using this content, reach out to LGU PDT at lgusnaped@gmail.com.